pleased to have these opportunities to come together as a reading community to celebrate new books this season. I can see we have a good turnout. There's lots of people joining us tonight right now from across the country. Both of our authors are here with us waiting in the wings. I encourage you to say hello in the chat box. If you want to, you can let us know where you're tuning in from. For any of you who are new to Zoom, you will find the chat and the Q&A functions at the bottom of the screen. If you wiggle your mouse around right now, you should see them pop up at the bottom there. And all you have to do is click on it. It will open the chat. Just remember to select all panelists and attendees so that your message goes out to everyone. And then you can send your greetings or comments. Similarly, if you have a question for one of our authors, you can click on the Q&A function, and that will pop up as well, and you can put your question into the queue. We'll be answering those after each reading. Are you ready to get started? Me too. But first, I would like to, we at All Lit Up would like to acknowledge the land on which we live and work. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people across Turtle Island, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to continue to work on this land. Miigwech. We would also like to acknowledge the ongoing support of the Canadian government through the Canada Book Fund, the Canadian Council for the Arts, and the Ontario Arts Council. And of course, we'd like to thank you for being here with us to celebrate independent books, independent publishers, and our featured authors. So cheers. Tonight, I'm excited to have you all with us as we celebrate our two featured authors, CJ Levine and Mariianne Mays Wiebe, who will each read for us from their debut novels, In Veritas from New West Press, and Kate Wake, published by DC Books, respectively. Following each of our readings, we'll have a short Q&A period where our featured authors will have a chance to answer your questions. We ask that you put your questions into the Q&A feature and not the chat box, and I'll read them out to our authors. If you've already submitted questions in advance through email, we have those queued up for you as well. Up first tonight is CJ Levine, a professional communications scholar who writes on television, gaming, and popular culture. CJ currently divides her time between two lovely cities, Ottawa, Ontario, and Red Deer, Alberta. Tonight she'll be reading from her debut novel, In Veritas, which is a tale about a young synesthesiac named Verity Richards who discovers a hidden world of magic inside an old Ottawa theater. With empathy and imagination, Veritas explores the nature of truth and the complexities of human communication. Verity is joined by a magician, his shadow dog, whom I think we'll meet tonight, and a knife-edged woman who is more than half ghost. Impossible people whose very survival is threatened by science, technology, and natural law. Welcome, CJ. If you would, I'd like you to take a moment to introduce your novel to the audience and set up the scene that you're going to read for us tonight.
Should I start talking now? Hi.
Hi.
Yeah, so I'm currently coming to you from Red Deer, Alberta. My second home is in Ottawa, Ontario, and I've written In Veritas, which is an urban fantasy that's set in Ottawa. And yeah, it's about our hero, Verity, who is a woman who can perceive multiple realities simultaneously, and her body processes that as a form of synesthesia, which means that all of her senses get jumbled up together. She hears rainbows or tastes things that she sees. She smells music, that kind of thing. And I'll read you a little bit from the book. This is just at the point where Verity is starting to realize that it's not just her, that there is, in fact, a whole world out there that other people are unable to perceive. So she's just leaving her townhouse, which she shares with her partner, Jacob. They've been doing a photography session for a woman and her two small children, but Verity is over it and she's leaving. So Verity and Jacob exchange her pleading glance for his quick grin, and she edges into the front hall while he was still talking. It takes only a moment to slip on her shoes and lift her jacket and a soft gray scarf from the coat rack near the landing. A moment later, and she's out the door, sliding her hands into her pockets. If the inside of the townhouse can be a well of confusion, marked by odd flurries of light and the snapping ozone of Jacob's ranging hobbies, then the city, as always, is a tornado. Verity stops on the front step and closes her eyes until she can reconcile the clouds that passing traffic sends snaking across her vision, and the way the sun's warmth smells of oil and cloves. Only when she finds her balance among the sounds of the street does she allow herself to look at the spreading leaves of the oak tree, which chime like bells and lightly sting her fingertips, or the slab of sidewalk that tastes of lint and soiled leather. When the world resolves itself, the dog is waiting for her. It is a worn shred of shadow sitting patiently at the foot of the stairs, and yet it has a particular solidity, as though the earth might crumble and open beneath the weight of its feet. Verity feels the gravity pull of it, and she stills for a long breath before judging it safe to descend the steps. The dog remains sitting, its yellow eyes watching. It wags its tail once. Verity tries to keep her gaze steady, but there's a bird in the tree chirping a streak of mauve. Then the door has opened behind her, and the two children are streaming out and down the stairs. The young boy's squeals are a spike through her temple. The mother follows more sedately, hands clenched on her purse and an irritated sigh puffing her lips. She pays Verity no attention whatsoever. "Puppy!" yells the girl. The black dog bares its teeth, and she wisely detours in the opposite direction, her small feet barely wavering. She has been distracted by something crumpled and dry on the sidewalk, about 10 feet away. Her brother follows. Verity just glimpses the sad remnants of a cracked dragon wing and a scaled, half-flattened tail. "Neat," crows the boy. His sister runs back to the base of the spreading tree. "I need a stick," she proclaims. "Need a stick. I want to poke it." She sets one hand against the bark of the tree's trunk and stands on tiptoe, reaching up for the branches several feet above her head. "What are you— Oh, leave that alone." The children's mother finds her voice, stepping forward, her heels clicking on the steps and then the concrete until she can get a view of the sidewalk and the crushed form that has caught her son's attention. "Don't touch that, honey. It's just a dead rat. It's full of germs." She ignores the dog, but she does cast a glare back over her shoulder at Verity. Someone should keep the property cleaner. Verity swallows the taste of cactus thorns. She wants to say, "We have no rats," but when she opens her mouth, the woman has already moved on, grabbing the little boy's hand and hurting both children further down the block. Her arm is already waving as she hails a taxi. When Verity looks back at the sidewalk, she doesn't see wings anymore, only matted fur and the stiff, wormy twig of a broken tail now naked and pink. The dog has paced several feet away down the sidewalk, where it sits once more, waiting attentively. "You want me to go with you," she guesses slowly. The dog waves its tail again. "Where?" The dog only cocks its head this time, one ear turning sideways. Verity sees the world stretching jagged and uncertain before her. In the shadow dog's attention, she feels the pull of the magician's gaze. In the maelstrom of the city, her balance shifts. At her back is the familiar comfort of the townhouse, the careful spaces she would know blindfolded, the golden dust of the kitchen, and the safety of Jacob's flashing grin. She could turn and take 5 short steps to refuge. On an impulse, she draws a breath and turns slightly to the side, gesturing with her chin. "The, dead thing on the concrete," she says. "What is it? Did you see a rat too?" She realizes, standing in the city street, talking to a dog. The dog looks at her. Then it wags its tail again, deliberately, and lets its black tongue spill out over its teeth. It is, she thinks, laughing at her. Verity sighs and steps forward. And you're on mute.
There we go. Thank you so much for that reading. It was delightful. Your writing is so descriptive. I think it's part of maybe the writing about Verity itself, but I love the description that you've used in that passage. So before we jump into the audience questions, I have a couple of questions that we at All Lit Up would like to ask you, if that's okay.
Okay.
So first, I would love to know what the kernel of inspiration was for In Veritas.
Well, you mentioned introducing me that I'm a communications scholar, and a lot of it is based on some just really basic communications theory, ideas about the limitations of language, the problems we have communicating our experiences to each other, telling complete stories to one another. So part of it was that. And part of it is the super nerdy origin story that I used to do a whole lot of role-playing games, either tabletop and online. And 20 years ago, I created all of these characters for different reasons and purposes. And then when I sat down and decided I wanted to write a novel, a lot of them were still living in the back of my head. So I kind of took some of that material and blended it. I took the pop culture stuff from the gaming and blended it together with all the communications theory that I use in my professional career. And In Veritas came out.
I love that mix. That is really, really wonderful mix. And I think if this sample was anything like the rest of the novel, then it's worked out wonderfully as a premise. Can you tell me some of the research that you had to do to inform Verity's synesthesia?
Oh, for sure. Almost none. I talked to some friends who are synesthetic, and the manuscript had a synesthetic reader before it was published. But Verity's perceptions aren't synesthesia in any kind of textbook sense, in any way that an actual person might experience. They're hyper real and fantastical and shaded with her ability to tell the difference between truth and lies, for example.
Okay.
So if one of the main themes of the book is the limitations of language, the way that words are often insufficient to convey realities. If someone's read the book, Colin isn't an angel. Ouroboros is not a dog. And Verity is not synesthetic in any kind of real world textbook sense. So mostly I took the basic concept and then I had a whole lot of fun with it.
So would your research maybe have been more into the mythology that informed these various characters?
You know, I was researching things like specific buildings in Ottawa and how old are they? When was the Chateau Laurier built? And where exactly is the Chaudière Falls power station located? That kind of thing. And yeah, then a few things like the Ouroboros. I wasn't particularly interested in the actual myth, but I was interested in the way the idea of it might have influenced the small boy who named the snake, that kind of thing. So I found myself Googling odd things at odd hours of the night, certainly.
Right. We have an audience member who would like to know how long it took you to write the first draft of your novel.
Oh, 3 years. I did it at 100 words a day for 3 years. And it was very, very slow. I wrote it 5, 6 sentences at a time because I was trying to do it around the edges of having a full-time career that also requires me to publish nonfiction and then fitting in the novel project on top of that. So very, very slowly. It was 3 years to do the first draft and 2 years to edit, and then another 3 years of querying and contracts and edits before it finally made it to print.
Wow, thank you. That's quite the process. How do you feel on the other side of it? Are you looking to jump into a new work?
You know, I've got a few scraps. I've got a few things that I'm toying with. I've always got a bunch of half-finished short stories on my hard drive. I won't lie, it's really hard to write right now. Mostly because the world is kind of on fire. But I am, and actually I just had to shepherd a whole bunch of students through the end of their term by moving everything online. So that took up a lot of time. But now that things seem to be not better, but evening out a little bit, becoming a little bit more predictable, I'm hoping to have some time to work on that second novel, even if it's also at 100 words a day.
That would be great. I think we're all looking forward to that. We have a shout out from Diane at On Spec. She wanted to let you know that she got a copy of your book today in the mail, and she's looking forward to reading
Diane.
it.
On Spec was my first professional publication in science fiction or fantasy, and I am so grateful to Diane and her crew for giving me that opportunity.
Thank you so much for joining us, Diane. Okay, let's see. What do you find the most rewarding thing about writing fantasy, especially considering our current state of the world?
It does have that pleasant element of escapism, doesn't it? I love being able to play around with metaphor and imagery, and my new book, if it ever gets off the ground, kind of has a ghost in it, maybe. And at the same time, I mean, writing about things that are real to people and themes and emotions that are real to people, but at the same time being able to play around with all of those fantastic elements is really fun. Mostly, my favorite part about it is that I am very seldom bored because I am always imagining things in my head.
Yeah, that would keep you amused, eh? So what do you read for inspiration? Are you an avid fiction reader when you're writing fiction, or do you avoid fiction when you're writing fiction?
I avoid the things that I think are going to be like the thing that I'm writing in the time when I am writing it. For example, now that In Veritas is finished and out, and I've published my Magic Door metafiction, I've been enjoying other people's Magic Door metafictions. So I've just enjoyed Alex Harrow's The 10,000 Doors of January and Erin Morgenstern's The Starless Sea, both of which were lovely. A lot of my sort of lifelong inspirations are definitely fantasy texts. Peter S. Beagle's writing The Last Unicorn, ever since I was a kid and saw the movie, even before I knew it was a book. His work, The Innkeeper's Song, Neil Gaiman's stuff, Robin McKinley. Most recently, N.K. Jemisin, Mary Robinette Kowal. I'm currently reading the new Martha Wells Network Effect, which it's science fiction, and it's about a non-binary cyborg security expert in space who also suffers from social anxiety. My favorite book last year was Tamsin Muir's, I may be mispronouncing her last name, and I'm sorry, M-U-I-R, Gideon the Ninth, which is about lesbian necromancers in space. So I love reading so many different things. I just try to avoid the thing that's most like whatever I'm writing at the time.
That was an amazing recommended reading list as well, if everyone was paying attention there. I also read The Starless Sea recently and loved it. It's a beautiful book. Okay, so you answered one of the questions I had for you. I would also like to know who personally inspired or motivated your writing journey, other than Diane at On Spec.
And yes, Peter S. Beagle, my lifelong hero. You know, one of the people that I thanked in the acknowledgements to the book is Daryl Bissell, and he was my grade 3 teacher. And he used to lend me books out of his filing cabinet when I'd gone through all the books that were available to read in the class. Sorry, my voice is going here. Another one is Aaron Rother, who was a friend of mine in high school, who was my very first editor on my very terrible novel that I wrote in high school that no one is ever going to read, but she has, and she remembers it. There are all these people who've just encouraged me at various points in my life. My family is amazing. My parents, Elizabeth and Jim Levine, my sister, Erica. And the book itself is dedicated to my grandmother, Madeline, who unfortunately didn't get to see it. She passed about 14 years ago, but she was probably one of the people in the family who was most like me. She had that history of creative writing and wanting to do things like that. And I think that she would have been thrilled. So it's probably a lot about family influence and people who've encouraged me.
It's so nice to have that thread and connection kind of continue for you through your writing, you know, to feel like it kind of throws back to something that you had in common with your grandmother. And will kind of stay with you. So I want to ask you, this is a question I want to ask both of our authors tonight. The old buildings really act as a kind of liminal space for the main character, and I wanted to ask if there are any old buildings that hold significance for you personally.
Is it weird if I say not really? There are old buildings that I love. It's not that old, but the Sagrada Familia in Barcelona is one of my favorite places. I really like the Chateau Laurier and the way that it changes the Ottawa skyline. My dad was in the military, and we moved a lot when I was a kid. By the time I hit grade 9, I was starting my 7th school, kind of moving around when I was a kid. So for me, my attachments are to people and probably objects, things that I've taken from one home to the next, but I don't know that I've lived in particular places or cities long enough to really get attached to specific places.
Okay. What did you learn from Verity while writing her story?
Good question. If a lot of characters are sort of aspects of their authors, Verity is probably my inability to talk to other people. I second guess every word that comes out of my mouth. I promise I'm doing it right now as I talk to you. So probably the importance of perseverance. She just keeps trying all the way through the book, even when she can't get things across, even when it goes badly, she just keeps chugging along. And I think that's probably the most important takeaway that I had from it.
That is lovely. That's a good lesson to kind of keep chugging. I like it a lot. If anyone has further questions, I think we have time to take a couple more questions. I'll just remind you to pop them into the Q&A so they come queued up for us here. We have somebody who would like to know more about the title of the book and the cover. You have a beautiful cover design.
Thank you. Shout out. Okay, so the cover, first of all, is by Kate Hargreaves, Hargreaves. And she did a lovely job. I always secretly wanted Ouroboros on the cover of the book, so I was so pleased when we managed to make it happen. She did an absolutely wonderful design. The title kind of fits in with what I was saying about one of the themes of the book being our inability to communicate things. So there are a couple of levels on which it can be read. Most people are familiar with the phrase in vino veritas, right? And that's what they'll associate the title with the book is, the idea, in wine there is truth. And I took that word out of the middle and we just get in veritas, which you would think would translate as in truth, although the Latin gets mucked a little bit. So it could mean in reality. It could also, it needs to be something like in veritate. I'm not a Latin expert. This is also some of the research that I did, was trying to figure out how the title of the book would work. Of course, it's a reference to Verity, our hero, but also you have to envision it with that missing word, in veritas. So in something, some ineffable, indescribable concept, there is truth. And that was the third level that I kind of wanted the title to be read on. So shout out to New West Press, because they never once asked me to change the weird title of my weird book, and I really appreciate that.
I love it. Multiple meanings. It's very nice. Okay, we have someone would like to know who your first reader is. Do you have a first reader?
I have a writing group. So yes, Anne Price, Dan Whiteside, Diana Napton, and Adrian Orr are in my writing group. And Adrian has joined us more recently, but Dan and Diane and Anne read the very first draft when I said, hey guys, I'm gonna write a novel at 100 words a day. And I gave them the first 1,100 words, and I think that was in 2012. And they've stuck with me since then, so.
Amazing, wonderful. You mentioned that you write your characters from the time that you were playing tabletop games. Do you ever find that you write people or personalities of people that you know into your stories?
If I did, I wouldn't admit it. Let's put it that way.
All right. Okay, I think this might be our last question, unless anybody has anything they want to submit last minute. Get those questions in. What was the process of working with an editor like for you, given that this was your first book?
Amazing, actually. My editor was Jenna Butler at New West, and Jenna and I are friends. Like, we were friends before she was my editor. I don't know if that makes the process better or worse. I think it had the potential to make it very fraught, but we were quite careful about that, really respectful of each other, and we get along really well, and she was amazing to work with.
That's so great to hear. Okay, well, thank you so much for reading for us tonight and for answering all of our questions. Thank you to everyone in the audience for submitting your questions. Those were great questions. I think we've had a really good time with CJ Levine tonight. If the reading tonight whet your appetite, we encourage you we encourage you to order a copy of In Veritas from allitup.ca and to take advantage of our current nationwide free shipping. Plus, we're giving our audience 20% off of tonight's feature titles until May 19th with the promo code Reading Room. That's all one word and all caps. Just enter the code at checkout, and we're going to pop the link for In Veritas at allitup.ca into the chat box for you. There we go. So you can access that from the chat box, or it's in your program later that you got with the email, so you can always look it up if you want to check that out later. You could also buy a copy of this book from your local indie bookseller. In the chat box, we're going to also share a link to a handy map that will let you find your local indie bookstore that's currently offering delivery or curbside pickup right now. So thank you so much to CJ and to New West Press for being here in the reading room with us tonight. That was a really great first reading. And it's my pleasure to introduce to you our second author of the evening, Mariianne Mays Wiebe, who is going to read from her debut novel, Kate Wake, which was published by DC Books. Mariianne is a Winnipeg poet and a professional editor with a lively interest in history, as well as performance and visual arts. She works in communications at the University of Manitoba, where she is also the editor of Teaching Life magazine and the Bulletin newspaper. Mariianne has written a lot of poetry in her life, and she's still slightly surprised that her first published book is a novel rather than a poetry collection. Personally, I love it when poets write novels because the language is often gorgeous. As if to prove my point, an earlier version of this manuscript won the 2013 Robert Croce Award for the best creative thesis at the University of Manitoba. Kate Wake is an elegant variation on the Eurydice Orpheus myth that reconsiders the roles of trauma, madness, and memory in relation to art. In it, we meet two wonderfully complex women who are both named Kate Wake. Please welcome Mariianne. Mariianne, we'd like you to tell us a little bit more about your novel and just set up the scene that you're going to read for us tonight.
Hi, everyone. First of all, I want to say thank you to everyone who came out tonight, I guess. The bonus of having this online is being able to have people from all across the country join. So that's been kind of thrilling to be able to invite friends and family from all over the place. So yes, this is my novel, Kate Wake, and the novel actually follows two timelines, one historical and one contemporary. And the historical part of the novel follows a character named Kate Wake, and the contemporary protagonist is actually her great granddaughter, whose name is not Kate Wake, but whose name is, her first name is Katie. Excuse me. So I'm going to read to you from a little further on in the book, about here, about 3/4 of the way in. And I'm reading from the contemporary timeline. And Katie is, this is kind of Katie's story. So we follow Katie through kind of piecing together her great grandmother's story. Kate Wake, and her grandmother was someone that she finds out has lived and died at an insane asylum, formerly known as. And this is something that she finds out and she kind of has to piece together, but she's also piecing together parts of her own story. And so the novel actually happens in around 2008, and she's also kind of piecing together her past from about 10 years ago when she's kind of gone through a trauma. So the whole story kind of drives towards her piecing all of this stuff together and kind of working out some stuff along the way. So this part that I'm going to read is called The Hill. And The Hill is AKA, also known as Blue Hills Valley Mental Hospital. And she and her friend Billy, who she's hanging out with a lot, are spending a lot of time there. And things get a little creepy and a little maybe troubling, concerning. So, The Hill. Billy and I spend more time together, and I ramble on about my life. He takes an interest, shows up at work during or after every shift. Too much interest, says Edna, but I don't care. I'm lonely, feeling desperate. What do you mean, I ask? She shakes her head ominously. How could someone possibly take too much of an interest, I press. This one is bad news, she says, and nothing else. We visit the asylum almost every day and every weekend. Billy hangs out in the lounge where I'm working most nights, ignoring me and writing feverishly. Wolf, his brother, comes in sometimes. His gaze lingers on me. He is large with cool blue eyes, and my insides buzz when he is in the room. I have respite help for my brother John Henry during my night work hours and for the mornings, which are when I sleep. John Henry is still in a form of school 2 days a week, but the rest of the time, I drag him with us because he loves exploring inside the buildings. Once in, we can roam at will among the abandoned machines and beds and gurneys and wheelchairs. The interior is uncanny and enchanting and adds to the sense that we are inhabiting but also creating another world, a world that in some ways has nothing to do with us at all. It's liberating. Blue Hills Mental Hospital is completely deserted in spite of its sprawling, intimidating presence, impossible to ignore, situated on the hill just outside of Blue Hills Valley, overlooking the city. Everyone saw the abandoned buildings to the east. You can say don't look back all you like, but there it was. And the amazing thing was that most everything inside the buildings had remained as it was, or at least had stayed in storage. The medical beds, machines, and sundry furniture were all there, all just left behind. Being devoid of any real function or use for contemporary medicine, the contents were also a very real reminder of psychiatry's arcane origins, its muddled, disordered pathways, and generally flawed and uneasy history. In the early 1980s, some undaunted someone had set up in one of the buildings a pseudo-museum complete with all of the abandoned equipment. She was a former psychiatric nurse who'd worked there through many of the formative years of the institution, through its time as an asylum and mental health center, through its various incarnations. Her name was Lily Glidis Small, and she was not one to be bothered by embarrassment. In fact, her unspoken motto seemed to run along the lines of a certain sly delight with any type of attention. Everyone called her Jay, same as her aunt, who was the original Blue Hills matron, another reason she interested Billy in the first place. Billy had somehow fitted her in as a character into his ongoing project and film about the hill. And she was eager to show us the museum she'd set up there and was available whenever she was asked to tell us stories about her life as a nurse, and she had great stories. And in the museum, she had a painting that she declared was, quote, of a patient named Kate Wake, who had been a singer and very famous until she got her throat slashed and had to come back to Canada, but a real beauty nonetheless. So sad what happened to her. I was astonished by it. My whole body tingled when I saw the painting. the one that Billy had truthfully claimed he knew about. And there was another painting, signed KW, of roses and wild greenery in a mason jar on a table, a brimming heap of apples in a straw basket. No one knew this stuff existed. It was pretty clear that the museum was not in any way an official museum. Located in the basement of the main reception building, it was the first thing I saw when Billy took me down there. He howled with laughter at my bewilderment, but it was the oddest space. Everything haphazardly tagged with typed labels and some archaic catalog system that included long lines of letters and numbers, some with dates and brief descriptions. Billy called her J. Little and had her narrate parts. She had to be at least 80, and she was little, wizened and shrunken and small, with leathery skin, dark, darting eyes, a brisk, efficient walk, and a wary way about her, as though her instincts were at odds with her body's efficiencies, like a vexed cat, alert and vigilant. Like the site itself, Lily, or Jay Jr., was an unguarded storehouse of information about what had really gone on back in the day. Lily had worked there since 1931, when she was 17. The place had been her life. And she took us through it all, her voluble, unfettered enthusiasm, almost uncanny in itself. Strangest of all, and this was purely Jay Jr.'s touch, she had somehow procured ancient mannequins discarded by old department stores and had dressed them as nurses and patients and so on, so that when you went from one into another room, you might see an entire, quote unquote, psychiatric history scene laid out before you. A tableau of badly painted, chipped, life-size dolls with bad wigs and painted green eyeshadow looking right at you from their unrealistic, stiff poses. Patient mannequins in beds facing the wall, with nurse mannequins hovering alongside, arms outstretched, presumably ready to administer treatment or restraint. And of course, they're all female. Through all of it, Jay never stops, talking, talking, talking. We are moving through everything, her leading with alacrity, proud as a circus barker with these mannequins as her performing horses and trained seals, her acrobats and freaks. Still, a twinge of sadness and an anxiety bordering on alarm sort of stabs me as she's narrating so casually and chattily, only because it makes me think of Kate and the probable treatment she might have experienced there as well. And there's a knife that belonged to a patient named Billy. Billy takes an instantaneous liking to that. Billy Spink's knife, reads the label. My stomach ache persists until we leave.
There we go. That was so evocative and intriguing, an excerpt. Thank you so much. It's I really love having authors read their own work because they're so emotive and they know the story so well. So you get such a delightful reading, and that was one of them. Thank you so much. So before we open the floor to questions again from the audience, and I want to remind you, you can just pop your questions into the Q&A function at the bottom there. I have a couple of questions that I have lined up already. So after writing poetry for a number of years, how did a novel like Kate Wake begin to take form for you?
Thanks, Tan. That's a great question. I love that question. There are a lot of, I feel like there are a lot of different answers to that. And one of them is that, I've written a lot of different kinds of things in my life, plays, essays, stories, but a lot of poems for sure. And a lot of my poetry has a narrative element. And I think the other answer to this question is that this story started as a thesis. And at first, when I was kind of working on this, I was kind of thinking that it might be like a set of poems or something like that. And, at some point, the characters kind of pulled me into something else. And I think, one thing that I've always thought about a lot and have been a little obsessed with is the question of form. And so with poems, form is kind of one of the questions anyway, but I had been thinking a lot about, you know, how to find the best form to express something. And so just kind of as I was working through this and doing some of the research, and the characters were becoming more more alive, um, it was it just kind of became a story. And it was definitely that character Jay that was the nurse who kind of pulled me into this story. And then the other one was Kate Wake. You know, I kind of had this this vision of her like running through a forest, and that was really one of the first things that kind of pulled me in. And then I think the other thing was when I was doing um, some of the historical research, and I did an actual site visit as well. Um, I came across a grave site and a grave marker that said Kate Wake. And so that name was an actual grave marker that I found there. And there was no information that I could find about her in a historical sense. But I just found the name, you know, I just remember the moment when I was telling my thesis advisor, who I think is on the call as well, George Tolles, you know, maybe this name is just the gift. Maybe I need to just take this as the character in my novel with a name like that and the word wake in the title. It seems, you know, kind of like a gift, and it seems pretty evocative, and you kind of ran with it from there. So that's kind of how it went from poetry into a narrative. And I will just say too that a lot of my poetry also has kind of narrative elements as well. So that's kind of a long-winded and probably not complete answer, but.
Was there any spin-off pieces? Were there any poetry or, you know, bits of drama that came out of your writing, Kate Wake?
Well, there's a lot of poetry that's included in the book, and I think that's partly, you know, so partly the contemporary character, Katie, um, I'm going to say she's something of a, sorry, I'm just listening to my cat wheezing in the corner. I'm going to say the main character, Katie, is something of a poet, kind of a wannabe artist. And she's also kind of struggling through this whole question about poetry, I think. She's struggling through her story. She's struggling through trying to pull together like her past and her relationship with her mother, and working through her great grandmother. And I think she has a lot of anxiety around the whole question of poetry in a way. And I think what kind of became clear to me as I was working through the story was that she, you know, there's all these kind of fragments of her life, and her real anxiety, I think, is that, you know, she's not going to be able to pull these together. And so she's kind of slightly allergic to poetry, even though these bits of poems keep coming to her in the way she's trying to tell her story or trying to piece it together. But I think that's something she's kind of working through the novel for sure.
Right. I like that there's poetry woven through it, and that we're working with her as she's working these things out. I think that's a lovely way to kind of come together on a problem with a character. We have several people who would like to know about the asylum, if it's a real place, what inspired it. So tell us more about that.
Well, Blue Hills is an imaginary place, although there is a lot of historical research that went into it. And the hill is definitely imagined. But again, I did a lot of research into a nearby asylum, which was the second one built in the Canadian West, at Brandon, Manitoba. And I think it started off as a boys' reformatory institution. And then that was quickly amended when I think there was like for an entire year, there was only one boy in it, this poor boy who had to live there for an entire year by himself. And then because these asylums were becoming so, I guess in a way, popular, but also a way of kind of extending imperialism into the West. And there were these huge institutions, and they kind of, you know, connoted imperial power, but also brought a lot of prestige and also a lot of work to everyone who was working in them, and to the communities where they were built. And so, yeah, that asylum, the Brandon Insane Asylum, is a real thing that existed. I think it was built. I'm really afraid of quoting dates here, citing dates here. But I think it was built in the just before the turn of the century, I will say, to be safe. And yeah, I mean, I think, when I was doing the visit, it was really, I mean, one thing that was really moving to me was doing that site visit and seeing all of those. There's a nearby cemetery, actually, and there's all of these unmarked graves, and then some that have just a name tag, and no dates, no date of birth, and no death date. And I just found that so kind of overwhelming to think of all of these people who lived, years there, some of them, and also died there. So I found that very moving. And then also doing the research into, one thing that really, really caught me was just the nursing story, and the whole story about mental nursing, which was a profession that was really taken on by a lot of women. And it started out as being, basically working as attendants. And that story really caught me. So that was kind of two ways that I was kind of pulled into the history, but also served as a really great jumping off point for the stories.
What surprised you most in your research about mental health history?
Oh boy, what surprised me most? I mean, I think it was the story of the nurses that probably surprised me the most. I wasn't aware that there was this whole kind of fight for professionalism. I wasn't, I might have guessed that it was mostly women who were doing these jobs. I mean, as I was doing the research, one of the people that was in my mind too was my grandmother, who, as a young woman, didn't work as a hospital attendant, but did work as a maid and nanny for wealthy people in the nearby city. And during that time, that was considered a pretty brave thing, I guess, for her to do. And I just kept thinking about all these young women who were essentially living there with these people too. And they were often sending money home to their families, and this was what they did. And so I think that probably was something that surprised me the most about it, was just knowing that it was this whole economy, this whole thing that happened that isn't really thought a lot about now.
Yeah, it's like a kind of a hidden women's history that we keep getting these glances into with these kind of beautiful historical novels. There's so much research that goes into it. And when you can embody a historical character and finally give voice to the things that you've been learning about, it's a chance for us as readers to also kind of delve in there with you and have someone kind of represent the story for us and the history for us, and to make it very real, and to make it, to connect with it in such a visceral way through your characters. It's one of the things I really enjoy about historical fiction and historical threads in fiction is finally being able to kind of connect with those moments. We have a couple of questions about your writing practice. So they would like to know both how long it took you to write this, and also kind of how you started. Did you have a storyline or a full plot arc before you started writing, or did you start writing and have the story reveal itself to you along the way?
Those are great questions. Thanks very much. Well, it did, like I said, it did start as a thesis. So I think there were two things that kind of started it. One was, doing like all of this research, and kind of, my dad's a big history buff, and just hearing stories, family stories as well, that kind of propelled the plot line a little bit for me, and just kind of wanting to balance these two narratives, like the contemporary narrative, but also that historical narrative. And what was the other question? What is my writing?
Yeah, like just a bit about your writing practice. I think you started this, you said, in 2012.
Yeah, it probably started before that, but that was the first version, which was a thesis. And the other thing that I should mention is my advisor, definitely George Tolles, definitely kind of helped me with these characters and kind of, to kind of pull the characters through this narrative line that I didn't really quite know where it was going, but also made it really fun. So, it's potentially a heavy story, but I think there's a lot of humor in it as well, just because the characters were so lively, and Jay in particular is kind of a very exuberant and fierce, feisty kind of character. And she I think, through her story, she makes some questionable decisions too, but it's slightly entertaining as well. So,
Hmm. And what was it like for you creating two different timelines within your narrative?
That's a great question too. You know, that I did not find that. I found that really fun, actually. I mean, I think, going back to this question of form, um, I think it was just really fun to kind of think about, I mean, I think one of the things that I was trying to do is kind of create a form for Katie, the contemporary narrative, to kind of filter her experience through and to kind of work through all these things. So having that double timeline really worked well to kind of take it towards that point in the narrative where things are kind of revealed and it becomes, things kind of become clear. Because I think with form two, like one of the things that I've been thinking about, I had experienced myself a trauma that I was also kind of working through and asking questions about, and so kind of having a character that was kind of working through some of this um, gave me a chance to kind of think about form in a more concrete way, I guess.
Right. Did you work on both timelines at the same time, or did you kind of, okay, so you don't like complete one and then supplement, or they have
No,
to work
I
off each
very
other?
much worked on both at the same time. And like I
Okay.
said, like, they really felt like, they really felt like parallel tracks in a way that were kind of informing and bouncing off of each other. Maybe similar to, how poetry works, where you have like different resonances that are happening throughout. So I think that's what I really
Right.
enjoyed about the different timelines.
Yeah. And I'm sure they're inspiring each other as you move through the manuscript.
Definitely. Yes. Yeah.
Someone would like to know how you came up with the idea of Jay's Museum. When you researched the Brandon Asylum, did you discover that the equipment had been left there untouched?
That's a great question. I had the chance and the wonderful opportunity to actually tour that space with a former psychiatric nurse. And some of those,
Ooh,
yes, it no longer exists. It's since been renovated, and the space has been recouped and is being used for something else. But at the time, it was, well, it definitely had its oddness, let's say. They kind of did have some psychiatric scenes set up, like some of those mannequins actually existed,
oh
which
my.
I mean, it kind of freaked me out the first time I toured. Um, so I don't have any recommends on tours that are still that are still open, but it was definitely something that inspired, part of the storyline in the novel, because it was just this really, I think what struck me about it was how incongruous the space was. There was this psychiatric nurse who had, worked there for a good part of her career, and she was clearly very proud of what she had, what she had done, and clearly it's something to be proud of. And at the same time, I knew that space, that space was it was kind of spooky. It's huge. It was completely empty. There was room upon room of old machinery just kind of in storage. And then there was this really strange, odd little museum, this kind of informal archives that, I'm not sure how many people, and would really want to acknowledge, because I think it's a weird history, you know. There's a lot of pain around it. There's some perhaps embarrassment about the types of medical, um, approaches that were taken, that people don't want to think about, really. And so this incongruity, I think, was really inspiring to me in creating it.
Right. Yeah. Okay, I think we're gonna have maybe one or two last questions. So if anybody would like to slip a question into the Q&A, please do so now. I would love for you to tell me what you have been reading in isolation.
Okay, so what I've been reading in isolation, I'd be curious to know what everyone else has been reading in isolation, but I have been reading some Chekhov, some short stories, maybe partly, I think one of the things that when I was writing the novel, and I wrote it over quite a period of time and kind of in separate time periods as well, and one of the things that I did read a lot about when I was writing was, besides the history, I was also reading a lot of poetry. I was reading Stephanie Bolster, who I love, Canadian poet, love her. And she actually inspired, little parts of the novel. I was reading Kate Moses, her book about Sylvia Plath called Wintering, which is one of the most beautiful novels I've ever read in my life, and inspired part of the novel as well. So I was reading all of these things that kind of kept me in that atmospheric place that I really, really wanted to stay in. And that kind of had a bit of a sense of maybe timelessness, and that's kind of what I'm drawing out with, the time that we're going through now. Maybe feels has that weird sense of like, how is time working? I'll talk to somebody else, say like, oh, did I talk to you like 2 weeks ago, or was that 4 weeks ago? Was that 2 days ago? So I find that Chekhov is interesting too, like with his just the feel of time in his stories is really interesting. So that's one. And I've been reading, I want to recommend this book, which is called How to Read a Poem by Edward Hirsch. This is really lovely. I don't need to know how to fall in love with poetry, but nonetheless, this is a really great read, and it's kind of soothing. It's broken down into really lovely chapters. I'm also reading something called My Bright Abyss by Christian Wyman, who is another poet that I really love, and his stuff is more essay-like. I'm reading a lot of Anne Carson, and I'm reading this really great book that I would really highly recommend called Marguerite by Marina Kemp. And it has a lot of description, and the characters, it's a bit of a character study. And it's just a beautiful novel. It's also a debut, which is kind of amazing to me, and it's really lovely, and the descriptions are really rich, and I'm enjoying that.
It sounds really good. Yeah, that's it sounds like you've been keeping good company during this isolation.
Yeah, that and partner, family, friends. Not just all in here, even though it feels pretty virtual sometimes.
I know. Thank goodness for the people in our lives.
Mm-hmm.
We have one person would like to know how you set up a tour with a psychiatric nurse. How did you make that arrangement?
I reached out to someone there. I'm trying to remember how it all happened. It was a pretty long time ago, and she was older then. So it was somebody at that time who, I'm not entirely sure I remember, but yeah, I'm not entirely sure I remember how I set up the tour, but I did a couple of site visits, and I think somebody had told me about this nurse who was doing tours and who had set up the museum, and that's kind of how that came about. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. We'll have someone looking to set up their own tour, I'm sure. So thank you to everybody for your thoughtful questions. Once again, I'd like to encourage you to grab a copy of Kate Wake from All It Up, where we're currently offering free shipping everywhere in Canada, and 20% off if you use the Reading Room promo code. We'll share that link in the box for you right now in the chat box so that you can get yourself a copy of Kate Wake, or in Veritas tonight. We'll also remind you that you can look at the indie bookseller map and pick a bookstore close to you that is open for delivery or pickup. They are open coast to coast. I'm sure you can find one nearby. Thank you so much again to Marianne and to DC Books for being part of the reading room tonight. That brings us to the end of our programming. We really hope that you've enjoyed the reading room events. There are still several more to come later on in this month, including a midday treat this Friday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, when we'll be hearing from Gold Rush by Claire Caldwell of Invisible Publishing and If Tenderness Be Gold by Eleanor Albanese at Latitude 46 Publishing. Or you can join us again next Tuesday evening at 7:30 Eastern, when we're going to hear new work from 3 fantastic poets. There's the slide there. If you want to check that out, pop a reminder into your calendar. If you're not already following All It Up on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, we encourage you to do so. Our handle on all of those platforms is All It Up Canada. Thank you once more to our authors, to CJ Levine and to Mariianne Mays Wiebe, to our publishers, New West Press and DC Books, who helped make this event happen, and to everyone watching from home. We thank you for spending your time with us tonight. I wish you good reading when you get your novels later, and I wish you all the best for the evening to come. Have a great night.